My name is David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. It's great to have you here. We're very fortunate to have Richard Merrick with us today. There's a reason he's here, not just to give a talk, but he was here this morning. And if you were here before, you heard a great talk this morning by Josh Stoll, who basically this was his dissertation defense today. And I don't think I'm revealing a huge secret when I say that at some point in the relatively near future, he will be anointed Dr. Josh Stoll, although I can't say exactly when. He has a wonderful colleague from Sweden on his committee, Beatrice Krona. And if you know anything about Sweden, when you get your Ph.D. there, I got invited to be something called an opponent, which is a kind of a strange medieval thing. And after, if you survive having your interactions with your opponent as a PhD candidate, then they have crazy parties and parades through the streets and all of this stuff. And so I just hope that Jim and the rest of the committee have big parades planned.
You forgot to get an opponent.
Oh, boy. I'm sure you can find one, probably right here in the room. So congratulations, Josh. He's going to be, by spring or so, an assistant professor of marine science and policy in the School of Marine Sciences. And we certainly look forward to an even closer association with him. The Mitchell Center played a small role in the work that he and his colleagues did, and we look forward to having him as a fellow here. So congratulations, Josh. Josh will introduce Richard Merrick, and I just want to say, because you're in the Mitchell Center, I know that Senator Mitchell would want to remind you all to go out and vote tomorrow.
If you haven't already done so.
Right.
Consider this my party, then.
Yes.
I have the pleasure of introducing Richard Merrick. I won't. Don't worry. Richard Merrick is the chief scientist for the National Marine Fisheries Service. He oversees 6 science centers and 30 or so labs. For me, he's been on my committee. I've had the pleasure of knowing him since 2011. One of the things that stands out about Richard is his ability to get things done, which I think is an important thing to do in the public sector. He's been a real driver on putting science in the Arctic agenda, I think is fair to say, in forwarding climate science and also forwarding ecosystem-based fisheries management. I want to, before I have him come up here, I wanted to just give one little anecdote to sort of highlight how he gets things done. And that was when I worked for the National Marine Fisheries Service in their Office of Policy. We have this long process of how you develop policies. They go through these reviews and these 10-day waiting periods, and then this filing process and reviews and revisions and so on and so forth. And there was pressure to develop a policy on electronic monitoring. And so, here goes this year-long process. And overnight, Richard wrote a policy and put it on my boss's desk. And people were kind of scratching their head, how did he do that? But I think he's been effective at doing that kind of work, getting things done in his role as Chief Science Advisor for the National Marine Fisheries Service. Today he's going to be talking about resilient fisheries and communities arise from resilient ecosystems. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
So I don't want to take away from your party, so I'll try to make this relatively short. Jim told me this morning about your program here, the master's program, which is kind of intriguing because in a lot of ways it's the same thing I did, except I did it the hard way. But I got a master's of marine resource management and then a master's of biological oceanography, both from Oregon State. And that was sort of my core, and that's actually probably why I'm here, was having that policy background along with a strong science background was really important. I worked in Alaska as a field biologist for 17 or 18 years, and then went from there to run a program in Woods Hole at our center there for another 15 years before I went to headquarters for the end of my career, which is soon, I hope. I still publish a little bit, but really as a scientist, my real contributions are the policy things I've done. And we're going to focus today on EBFM, which is a nice compliment to what Josh presented this morning. Because he did the micro scale, I'm going to do the macro scale. But the two are complementary. But I think that without having that combination of science and policy, I could not have done this. Okay? Recognizing that in the government, to get anything done, science cannot do it by itself. You've got to have this policy part. And if you can get a scientist into that position writing the policy, it's really effective. We don't have to worry about the translation of going through the managers and all. We can actually get what we want. So I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the stuff we've done here. And I'm going to focus a lot of this on Maine. And I have to apologize that some of this comes from talking with Shelley Pingree about climate change and EBFM in Alaska, or excuse me, in Maine. Alaska and Maine to me seem so similar. And I mean, I was talking earlier about how my first field work here, when I moved to Woods Hole, was actually here in the Penobscot, and working with harbor seals. And offshore there, it looks just like here in Southeast Alaska. So if you've ever been there, you're going to feel really comfortable when you go to Juneau in that area. Anyway, the other sort of the takeaways, and the story here is that we've actually been trying to implement EBFM within NOAA since at least the Clinton administration, and we haven't made a whole lot of progress. I was fortunate enough when I took this job, not only to my first year in 2011 to meet Josh, but to be able to hire 3 new scientists as senior scientists for the agency. One of those is Jason Link. And some of you may know Jason. He's my senior ecosystem scientist. I kept him in Woods Hole. I want to keep him away from headquarters, keep him in the field so he can keep doing research. But having somebody like Jason work with me made this stuff possible. I mean, I'm the 3rd chief scientist that Fisheries has had. I cannot understand how they did the work that they did before without having the folks I had work with me. So that's another thing to learn, is build strong teams to work with you. Anyway, so we've actually made progress since Clinton's era. A lot of it has occurred in the last 3 years. The agency is really committed to the idea of resilient communities, because this is all supporting that. That ecosystem-based management can work. It's a challenge. And I actually did a seminar last week for the National Ocean Council talking about what we've done here with EBFM as a model for other federal agencies. But the big issue, and the thing that I was trying to explain to them, is you can't do this without all these partnerships. It took us 2 years, basically, in contrast to the other policy statement, about 2 years to get the policy statement to the point where we were comfortable with it. And it's only like a 4 or 5 page document, because we wanted to socialize it with our partners. And without having them be part of this, we weren't going to make any progress. We'd still be back there with the Clinton era. We'd be talking about it but not doing anything. So those partnerships with councils, commissions, tribes, it varies whichever area we're working in, but having them on board has really been important. And it's still a problem. We're still working with them, doing a lot of hand-holding, because this is a real culture change. So back to Maine. To me, Maine could be the poster child for EBFM. It's a nice, simple system. It's a state that's really focused on marine resources. What happens in the Gulf of Maine really affects the coast, affects your coastal communities. So if we can get EBFM to work right, either at the large scale or the small scale, like Josh was talking about, we got it licked, and we can show the rest of the country how to do it. And part of the reason that it's been easier for us to talk about this in New England is the changes that are occurring in the Gulf of Maine. So there used to be lots of cod in the Gulf of Maine, and these are the result of our surveys. So if you go back to 1968, there were cod everywhere, all the hot spots. Basically now, it's all retracted back to Mass Bay. Some of that's due to overfishing. There also seems to be some clear signals of climate change affecting zooplankton communities, which affect juvenile survival. Then there's northern shrimp. Used to be a decent fishery, now closed. Again, there's a real strong climate signal that's going on there. So one of the things we did 2 years ago, we piloted this in the Gulf of Maine, is to look at the vulnerability of commercial fish stocks to climate change. We looked at a variety of environmental drivers. We looked at species, the 82 species that we manage federally in the Gulf of Maine, ranging from lobsters to scallops to to anadromous fish like Atlantic salmon, to river herring, to ground fish, and basically characterize them all first on their sensitivity to change to things like ocean acidification, or water changes in water temperature, and then model the climate exposure that they would see over the next 20 years. Basically, just looking at the lower axis, they're all going to be exposed to a lot of change in the system. Because we know the system is getting warmer, we know that ocean acidification is increasing. So the only thing that saves species is their biological sensitivity. Fortunately, there's a lot of them that are not particularly sensitive, but there are a number that are very sensitive. Anadromous species, or diadromous species, are very sensitive. A lot of the invertebrates are very sensitive. So we're going to see changes in a lot of species. All the way up here in the top, it's Atlantic salmon and bay scallops. If the predictions are right, both of those are going to be in a lot of trouble. Sorry, John.
We know.
Yeah. So this is part of the climate work we started to do. Now we're doing this around the country, but the Gulf of Maine was the first place we did this at. We then took that and linked that information back to the community analyses that we've been doing, community profiles, identified communities by their landings. So look at communities that landed shellfish versus groundfish, scallops versus lobster, and then characterize them by the vulnerability of the fish stock. And this is another measure of community vulnerability. This one looks at the vulnerability to climate change, basically. We've also done this for sea level rise and other factors, but this is the one basically looking at the reliance on commercial fishing and what's going to happen to those stocks. There are issues here. Red's not good. Coastal Maine's pretty red. So I mean, this is the sort of thing that when you talk to a lot of our congressionals, they really start to see that climate change is an issue. So we're not having any trouble selling this to New England. And one of the things that's nice about this, maybe the only thing that's nice about this, is you can use this as an entry point to talk about why we need to worry about an ecosystem. Because this is what's driving this. Changes in the Gulf of Maine are driving these changes in fish stocks. So why are we doing EBFM? You know, we have, as a scientist, I can see why, but why are we doing this within the agency now? Part of it is simply to clarify the agency's commitment. When Jason and I started this discussion 3 or 4 years ago, we assumed there must be an ecosystem policy or an EBFM policy for NOAA or NOAA Fisheries. Was nothing. So just writing a policy saying the agency was really going to be worried about this was a big deal. Second was, we know these changes are occurring, so let's start planning. Let's start getting our managers in a position where they can adapt their management practices to deal with these issues. And then finally, really start to think about the trade-offs that are happening, particularly in the coastal communities. Let's start thinking about what's going to happen if lobster isn't a dominant harvest in the future. And for us, one of the crucial things is we deal with a lot of species. We have 450 plus fish species we deal with. But we also have to worry about the ESA listed species. We have to worry about marine mammals under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. We do all these habitat actions. There's aquaculture. All of these have an ecosystem connection. And we're supposed to be providing management advice on these. So from the science side, we have to deal with these other areas. Are we observing the right stuff? Are we doing the right research and modeling? Are we synthesizing and assessing property? So if we change to EBFM, it's going to change all of these. We need to measure different things. We need to worry about processes, how species respond to ecosystem change. We need to do new types of stock assessments. And typically what we found is that when we're talking to our constituents, they don't really understand what we're talking about when we say EBFM or EBM. So we've developed this, Jason actually designed it, to try to explain where EBFM fits. Traditionally, when we just worried about a single species like cod, it didn't worry about predation, didn't worry about ocean effects. We do a stock assessment, give it to the Fisheries Management Council, and they would set a quota. And that's classic single species management. and we would wind up with a fisheries management plan. So we can actually do this better. We could do this by incorporating climate change or predators or habitat into this. So when we do the butterfish assessment in the Mid-Atlantic, we incorporate habitat into that. When we look at pollock in the Bering Sea, we're worrying about how climate affects recruitment. We're not worrying about any other real species other than how maybe there's some predation effects, but still a single species assessment, but now we're looking at ecosystem effects. So in our lexicon, that's an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. We still wind up with an FEP, fisheries management plan. Where we like the councils to move towards, our partners, is an EBFM approach, ecosystem-based approach, where it winds up with a fisheries ecosystem plan that includes all these issues of climate, habitat, and predators, but looks at multiple species at once. And there's a lot of manifestations of that, different ways to do that. One way to do it is like we do it in the Bering Sea right now, which is the one place where we're actually moving out right now on EBFM, totally. And there's an OY, an optimum yield for the whole system. We cannot take more out of that system than that amount. So if you look at all the single species stock assessments, whether done this way or this way, summed up the allowable biological catches, they're always greater than optimum yield. So we have to scale back the harvest to that level. And that may be one of the reasons that the Bering Sea continues to be highly productive. There are no overfished species in the Bering Sea, and that's the way it's been for 30 years. And that started when it wasn't across me, but when I got there in 1983, they already had that in place. We've done a lot since then with them to supplement that, but that system has remained stable, and despite having incredible fishing pressure, 2 million metric tons are taken out of the system each year, just in groundfish. That's more than some of the ABCs from everything else in the U.S. Yet that system continues to produce. So that's an example of one way to approach EBFM. Then ultimately, this is where people like to be, and we didn't want to touch that right now. But recognize that one part of EBM is fisheries. So if you view this as a modular system, our EBFM work plugs into here. You still need a way to look at how competing uses will affect the system. And we're getting there. The 2 ocean plans that are going to be released this year will be a step in that direction. So there'll be an ocean plan released for the Northeast and for the Mid-Atlantic. We're still not quite clear how everything fits together, but we're getting there. But that's multi-agency. This is us. So we can talk about this, we can do this. We've had a hard enough time getting this out the door, let alone trying to worry about that. Congress sort of likes this, because we can build the case there that this really helps manage fisheries, makes them more productive. Trying to go to the next step really gets them nervous, especially in some states. So we'll have to educate them. So the first step was policy statement. This is where we actually solidified what we consider to be EBFM and how to get there. So it gave us a basic framework, which I'll show you in a minute, and then the key issues here, interestingly, became: do we have a legal authority to do this? So we'd always done single species management. Lawyers have clarified, yes, we do. And finally, what are the elements of this approach? So let me go into a little bit of that. That's the policy statement. You don't need to memorize it. Given how much work went into this in the working group that worked on this for months, it doesn't seem like much of a product, but it's, for a policy statement on a big topic like this, it's not bad. But look what's highlighted, including the human communities. Humans are part of the ecosystems. The agency acknowledges that. So, to get there, within the policy statement, we also wanted to identify what the principles were that we thought went into EBFM. And again, you don't need to read the whole thing, but just recognize that outcomes were really what we started with, and the outcome was maintain a resilient ecosystem. And all this is basically the process that you do decisions, make decisions. What are your objectives? And what science do we need to support those objectives? Now, moving to the management realm, what are the priorities that the managers have? What are the options they have? And then what's our advice to them? So this domain right through here is something that we would call management strategy evaluations. And I don't know if you guys have talked much about that, but that's basically a model-based approach to trying to evaluate options that the managers could have. But you got to start with your priorities. You know? Do you want to worry about the ecosystem? Do you want to worry about communities? We had a conversation a little bit earlier today about what's more important, maximizing the economic benefit to the nation or maintaining small coastal fishing communities. Those are two different real approaches here. You can wind up with very different advice depending on which way you go. But both of those should be considered. So that was the policy. That came out formally this summer. The next step then was the roadmap of how we're going to implement that. The policy seemed like it was hard enough. This is the implementation phase, and that's actually become even more difficult, even though we keep telling our management partners, you're doing most of this, guys, already. This is in a budget-neutral environment. We're not asking you to spend a lot more money. We just want to say, here's the umbrella, and this is what EBFM looks like. And it's, again, this is cultural change. You're trying to get people to do things differently. There's a lot of resistance to it. So you have to take your time when you go through this. So ultimately, the roadmap, the guides how we expect the policy to be implemented, and it says, here's the options, what you could do. So the idea of an OY, that's one of the options. And some of the councils are either there or close to there. Using fisheries ecosystem plans as a mechanism for implementing this, that's another one. Almost all the councils are doing that. But ultimately what we wanted to be able to show people, and this continuing question that even came up in Josh's defense this morning is, what does EBFM look like? What is it? We wanted to be able to show what successful EBFM looked like. And that's what the roadmap basically identifies. What do you need to implement it? And how we decide whether we're there or not. And this is something that ultimately the centers and regional our managers will have in their activity plans. Lots of stuff here, but just to say, this is those same guiding principles with things underneath it of what we would expect to do in implementing that part. So I talked about fisheries ecosystem plans. That's one of the major products as an example. Down here under maintaining resilient ecosystems, how do you evaluate resilience and how do you evaluate community well-being? See, we're still thinking about communities. It may not have appeared in broadly as it should have, but it's there. Most all these are being done by one of the centers and regions or another. So that nobody's doing everything except maybe Alaska. And there's a lot happening. So again, we don't recognize what's going on and what could fit into EBFM until we step back and look at this. And we had an external review by NOAA's Science Advisory Board, which is a body of 20 externals, mostly academics, to look at what we had done with respect to implementing EBFM. They were surprised that a lot of the things they recommended we were already doing, which is nice for once. But they gave us other good recommendations. But I sort of grouped these as, here's the sort of things that the managers are doing. So FEPs are being developed in most of the regional fisheries management councils. 5 of them are active, the other 3 are coming. There's a lot of climate stuff that's going on. So we rolled out last summer the National Climate Science Strategy, and that was followed up by regional plans. So each one of our 6 regions has now developed a regional plan on how they're going to provide science to the managers on climate science. It's an ecosystem issue. It's part of the EBFM. And part of that, regional action plans, is to do both community vulnerability analyses and fish stock vulnerability analyses and for all of our stocks and all of our coastal communities. There's lots more room to add on to these. So this is most of this stuff is just the first brush to really identify what the low-hanging fruit are. So when we do the fish stock vulnerability analyses, we're breezing species in less than a year. If you did a really detailed analysis, it would take you 3 months to do a species. So we're trying to identify which are the most vulnerable species, which are the most vulnerable communities. And then we go back in and do more detailed work. This year, we did a review of each one of our science centers looking at how they're presenting ecosystem science. One of the cool things about this is that we do an annual review for all of our centers on some aspect of their science. This was the year we most were able to draw out the managers. So this is an external review. So we'll have 5 external folks come in and review some part of the center's portfolio. And for most of these reviews this year on ecosystem science, the panel has spent about half a day talking to the managers. Because one of my big concerns and where I sort of set this up was that the centers are ahead of the science centers are ahead of the regional managers in terms of the advice. And we've been really trying to work with them, but now we're dumping data on them and indices on them, but not quite ready to use. Trying to get them to move their heads over to the point where, yes, they start to realize that some of this information they really could use. So all the centers are now providing ecosystem indicators each year, telling a regional fisheries management council or a regional office, our regional office, indicators that show how the system is changing. They are not quite ready, except for Alaska, to incorporate that information into their standard business practices. So having them sit in this review and hear how you could do that was really informative. Again, trying to change that culture. And we continue to host a series of ecosystem modeling workshops, both within the U.S. and externally, to try to move this part of the science forward as well. And finally, there are the policies and the roadmap. There's a lot there that we've done in the last months, and most all of those line up with something that the managers have to respond to. And for those of you who are going to be scientists and move out into government, there's an issue there that they are very, very busy. And that's one of the differences between the centers and the regional offices for NIMS, the National Marine Fisheries Service, that the centers have a very different timeline or view of the future than a regional office does. They're dealing with the day-to-day management of things. And we actually have the capability to look further down the road. So it's part of our job is to push them a little further on, but getting them to deal with all this stuff that we're dumping on them, trying to get them to adapt to change, has been tough. So one of the things I'm learning here is how you get change incorporated into a management culture. And it's a difficult task. So if you guys have some courses you can teach these folks on that policy part, it'll be really, really useful because that's a tough transition, incorporating new information into a management world. But we've made progress, and there's a momentum going here now. The agency recognizes it all the way up to NOAA. Actually, the president has recognized a lot of the work we've done here. Some of the work we're doing in the Arctic now builds on this as well. So we've got the momentum. And I think the momentum will carry us into the new administration, and I'm hoping that we'll keep going. So having Josh coming out with his ideas can only help. And to me, one of the big things we need to look to in the future are projects like with Penobscot East. The idea of small-scale EBFM is really important. A lot of these problems are not LME, large marine ecosystem-wide. They're more localized. And a project like we've been talking about with Penobscot East Resource Center that Ted and Robin have been thinking about, maybe the future for a lot of the coastal communities and learning how to deal with these changes that are occurring there. Clearly, if you're worrying about all of the Gulf of Maine, the kind of management responses are going to be different than what would happen within here. So now actually coming out of Alaska, where there is a lot more sort of localized participation in the fisheries management process, where there are set-asides for Western Alaska communities and parts of the quota, really has reshaped how we deal with issues there. Trying to get that idea to this coast, this may be the kind of project where we can do that. That's one of the reasons I've tried to support what's been going on with Penobscot East. I'll pass this on to my successor because I think this is a really cool project. So in summary, in order for us to deal with things that are happening in the ocean, particularly with respect to climate change, we need to have an ecosystem approach. And if we're going to meet the Magnuson mandates, or Fisheries Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, or the ESA, we have to take an approach like this. It's been pushing this for years. We've never matured enough to be able to do it. I think now we're there. We're starting to see now what actually is EBFM. There's enough examples out there in the 8 fisheries management councils, the 3 commissions in the states, that we have pretty good examples of almost everything we want to do. And then, so we're doing a lot of it already, 20 to 30% at least, maybe more. And we want to maintain that dialogue. So getting the councils and our partners to keep moving has been really important. It's going to take a lot of pressure to keep them moving, but I think we can keep doing it. I'll stop there.
So, briefly mention my background to you, and then
Yes.
we'll move to marine biology. So, in ecosystem-based fisheries management plans as they're shaping up now, or as NOAA is envisioning it, are evolutionary processes considered in there? And if so, sort of how are they demarcated? Is it just in that biodiversity component, or are there elements here of harvest-based evolution, or adaptive capacity to climate, or so on?
Probably the one that most people would key onto would be adaptive processes to climate and how populations respond to things like that. It's a challenge for us in part because we don't know enough about the linkage between ocean conditions and survival or recruitment. We do know for some species, like pollock in the Bering Sea. We also have the issues of what's the system going to be like in 20 years. But it doesn't keep us from exploring scenarios. And we're seeing more requests from managers to do more of that. We're getting requests from industry to do that as well. But looking at how a population can adapt to the change seems really crucial. Again, there are things happening there we don't know how it's going to play out. Corals are an example that we're not really quite sure how they're going to ultimately respond to either acidification or to bleaching. So the lab work that goes on there is really crucial. But that's where we have to head. We have to be proactive. Okay.
I was wondering how the idea of optimal yield for Alaska for the system has ended up impacting the market and market access for those fishermen. Because it seems like some of the smaller canneries have a hard time switching over to different species. So what's happened there?
So the way it's been there so long that everybody accepts it. Okay. And if they recognizing them that when that went in 1978, 79, the fishery was still foreign. And there are those who believe that that's really why it was put there, just to put a lid on foreign fishery. But it stayed anyway. So everybody's always worked under that. And the way that it responds, since it always stays the same, is it's really the high value stocks get harvested first. So black cod or halibut, for example, they always come right off the top. And then most everything else is pollock. So the canneries, the groundfish canneries, such as they are, or the processors, don't really have to adapt that much from year to year. It's more the salmon canneries that respond, and that's not part of that discussion. The 2 million really refers just to groundfish. And salmon is managed by the state. Help?
Yeah.
Yes.
Some years ago, your slide on the shrimp fishery.
Yep.
Sort of made a couple of things click. Some years ago, I belonged to several of us were working for Andy Rosenberg at the time. Belonged to community-based fisheries thing, and when we took our shrimp deliveries, all of the shrimp were buried females, and we speculated at the time that the shrimp fishery was headed for closure because we were killing the buried females. Has anybody done any? Is there any relationship between water temperature and the gender development of the zygotes?
I'm a large whale person. In the recent day, but
We have a project actually, a SK funded project, look at how climate change it's a funding that's on the way. And I think our goal is to develop small scale but high quality fishery instead of go after volume, or probably go after the value. So, but I guess I'll answer that question.
Yeah.
I want to ask you a question.
Sure.
I have two questions actually. One is because there's a good opportunity for you to see. It's not many. It's not we do it.
You're just in Florida, right?
Yeah, but I just come back from so. One is what do you see the role of past available science and precaution approach in the EBFM? My second question is, did you see the differences, regional differences in terms of how EBFM is implemented in the U.S.?
We do that one first. Yeah, that was, if you look at Alaska, and EBFM is all over the place there. They've had an ecosystem report to the council since 1987. They've had this OY since the 70s. They've had a ban on small forage fish harvest. They've so on and so on. Go to the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean Council. They've basically done nothing there. So there's a wide difference between the regions. And even where, like, say, the West Coast versus the East Coast, the West Coast is far more, I think, more proactive than the East Coast is. Why? Maybe because it's a lot of the same fishermen that work in Alaska, so they're used to it. But they're ahead of the East Coast. And the Mid-Atlantic is really different than New England. So the Mid-Atlantic's, I mean, they're moving out on a forage fish amendment to be a major FMP for them. New England hasn't even thought of that. They're working on FEPs. Mid-Atlantic already put in a closure in all of the canyons. New England has not, but now we've got a monument there. So, yeah, there's a lot of regional differences, which makes it, on one hand, really difficult to deal with them because they're threatened. You're trying to make us think that they're all going to go to the same place at the same time. What we've been trying to say to them is that you're all making progress. You're just doing your own pace. We're a regional organization, so we recognize that. Helps them. It works with some of them. The other question about BSIA, depends what the question is. We always have to deal with best scientific information available. But if you're talking about a stock assessment, we have pretty clearly defined rules for how that's supposed to work. And a lot of that deals with how it's peer reviewed and so on. When it comes to this sort of information, it's in a gray area. But so what I try to do in policy, I basically set up with the centers is nothing gets used in a management decision unless it's been peer reviewed. And the centers every year go through an external review. So and then there's an internal review process within the centers for all science. SIA as a philosophy that all science needs to be peer reviewed, independently peer reviewed. So we do it that way too. But the formal definition when it comes to Magnuson, we really apply it most frequently on the stock assessment board. Okay. Yes.
Earlier you mentioned that there's been resistance to this type of management. I wonder if you could say more about that. Who's resisting and why?
We got resistance from almost everybody. Because it's basically, in the beginning it was just Jason and me, I think, trying to push this out. Even though people said we're doing this, we're going to do this, we're going to do it. But now I think we've moved most people's heads to the point where they all agree that yes, the policy statement is right on the mark. We need to do this. But then the next breath is, but we don't have the resources, or we don't have the knowledge, or we don't have something to do it. So now it's basically trying to move that next step and say, well, you're all doing something. That's good. If we can do one more thing, that's great. And we can share. We can provide some resources to you. We can reallocate some resources. Then they get scared if you talk about reallocating resources to this, you're going to take away from stock assessments. And argument then is, well, this just improves the quality of the stock assessments. It's better advice. So assuming we're not stopping you from doing any stock assessments, which we're not, and we're basically reallocating the money we set aside for research, then this could be a better product for you. But getting people to believe that and get them to change culturally has been difficult.
It's still everybody within the management.
Within fisheries, science side, I mean, I'm getting as much resistance, maybe more, from the centers, science centers, than I am from the regional offices from managers. Because the science centers are all short on money already, and we're telling them to do something else. And we've just gone through the climate regional action plans, which is a bunch of stuff in there to do as well. So they're seeing they're being taxed. That all of a sudden there's more things to do. They don't have any more money, and that's fair. So we just have to decide what gets done and prioritize it to be more efficient as possible. We can't do everything though. So some things won't happen. So what's the most important thing? And that's another story. Josh?
Where do you see the agency in 5 years with the EBFM stuff, and how do universities like the School of Marine Sciences or UW or Oregon State, how do we contribute to this work?
Well, things like the IEAs, integrated ecosystem assessments, if we can get that moving for Penobscot, that would be a great place for the university to intersect. Bringing in other science, because the process part of this is something that we need help on. If there's one thing we don't have money to do, is understand those basic relationships between ocean conditions or river conditions or estuary conditions and our trust species. So I need research that happens there in universities where we help it along and you get money from someplace else is really important and helpful. But recognize a lot of the things that we need to have done or we'd like to do, we just don't have the capability to do it. We may not have the expertise, or they're frequently very short projects. But that's the kind of stuff the university can really help us with. So I recognize that I'm in a bigger organization. I'm within NOAA, and there are other parts to NOAA. And there's another part of NOAA called the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research. They don't have a regulatory side, so I can ask them to do things that don't necessarily fit into the regulatory world, so they don't get the pressures that my folks get. So we can use them as well. So when we do the downscaling models for our climate models, we can go to them, they can give us help. But there's other things that universities can be really important partners on. The IEA, for example. Robin?
I wanted to ask you a question about whether, as we started to add more things to the consideration in fisheries management, we're all aware of how little we know. So we're basically acknowledging a data poor situation that we're in. And there are a lot of rules, particularly in Maine, that have been based on things that were not peer reviewed. The lobster measures, that kind of thing. And I'm just wondering whether there's any credible way to integrate formal thinking about data poor management into the science center's best available scientific advice for the managers.
So that's one of the things that we're really trying to do for a lot of the stocks. We have 450 fish stocks that we have to deal with. Most of those are largely unknown. I mean, if we got decent catch data, that's great. But we probably don't have survey data. We don't have age structure data. So we're very limited on a lot of the stocks. We stopped calling data poor, by the way.
Oh.
Data limited. And so coming up with ways to provide advice when you don't know a whole lot about a stock or an ecosystem is a challenge. We've made a lot of progress on individual fish stocks, but I think one of the challenges next is we're trying to predict what's going to happen in a system, an ecosystem, and provide ecosystem level advice. How do we do that when we don't know a lot about it? I would think that compared to the Gulf of Maine, we know an incredible amount about Penobscot. We can provide much better advice there than the center can provide the council about what's going on in the Gulf of Maine. So that could be a selling point.
This morning in Josh's talk, it seemed like one of the take-home messages was there's a lot of biophysical complexity in the systems you're trying to manage, but that to manage them effectively, you also need to pay attention to the complexity that has to do with social and economic see that in your work, and what would it take to kind of make that part of the, I guess I'd call it the research agenda for science to inform the way you do your work?
When I talked about the three senior scientists I hired, one of those was the economist social scientist. So that helps. Because in a lot of the cases, it's basically somebody that's saying, well, you should be thinking about social science right now. You shouldn't wait to the end when we're doing a regulatory impact analysis. You should think about it now. So having a champion like that is really important. We are headed in the right direction now that we've got that. We also have NOAA has a chief economist. So she'll help as well. But there's a long way to go. The work that, particularly, we've done fairly good on economics. On the social side, we're terrible. And that's not because the folks we've got aren't doing great work. There just aren't enough of them. And recognize that within NOAA, virtually all the economists are in fisheries. And I think all the anthropologists, except for maybe one, are in fisheries. So NOAA itself needs to step up its game. But forgetting about them, we need probably 2 to 3 times as much staffing as we have now. And we can't get anybody to give us any money. We've tried repeatedly to get NOAA and DOC to honor a funding request we put in, and we just can't get any traction. So we borrow from someplace else and keep doing it, and keep staffing it. But that's the problems we've got. I mean, we could go for the foreseeable future with the biological information we've got now. No more research would probably be okay. But the social impact of the decisions we're making are totally unmeasured. That seems to be the big area we should go. I keep asking. We've had a couple of big initiatives on the biological side. You've seen a couple of them here. Climate one was big. There's a social side to that, though. The EBFM one is big. There's a social science one to that. And everything else we've been doing in the last 2 or 3 years has always had a social side to it. And we don't pay enough attention to it. Josh pointed that out this morning. We tried, but it's not. Be a culprit. Yes. Anything else? Ted.
Yes, not on the social side. You haven't developed any strategies for integrating fine-scale ecological information with your large system approach?
Not at the management level. My personal strategy is that what you do in the NOBSCOT, John Kosik's doing in terms of the development of an integrated ecosystem assessment for that should plug into the LME. And if anything, it could be an indicator for what the rest of the system should be doing. I think the fine scale work that you're doing on potential for cod recovery as the river recovers may be a really good example for why we want to take down dams besides just doing the salmon, that there are knock-on effects in the ocean that nobody's really thinking about. So as a science issue, yes. Management side, I think people are still kind of grapple with that. So that seems to be the big challenge as we go into the future, and we talked about that a little earlier today. That trying to get traction and keep getting support from the agencies depends on the managers starting to realize how important your work is. I think we have momentum now, so maybe we can keep going. So long as Robin keeps talking to Sam and your predecessor, or your successor rather, talks to Sam too. It's an interesting thing being in an agency that's sort of half science and half management. Nobody else in NOAA is in that situation, so they don't quite understand why we do some of the things we do. But you always have to think about there's these managers that they actually take your science and turn it into some conservation action. So you need to be talking to them. You need to figure out, what science can they understand, how can they use it, what are the products they use. It's a challenge.
Piggybacking off of that, given that you just outlined the degree to which social science is a challenge and moving beyond economics is a challenge, how would you answer the same question but about fine-scale community or fine-scale social information beyond the fine-scale ecological information? And I asked that question basically asking whether we need to build up within the EBFM framework a better inclusion of social science before we start trying to plug in fine-scale community-oriented information, or is there an opportunity here to plug that in as we build it?
So right now, the councils look at that information solely in the context of the regulatory impact review.
Sure.
So they're looking at both the economic and social science analysis. That's pretty straightforward, and it really doesn't get to some of the stuff that you would probably really want to do. The flip side, though, is that slide I showed you before of the connectivity between fish stock vulnerability and community vulnerability. That resonated more with policymakers than any other slide that I've shown on climate change. They see that. So the challenge now is to try to turn that into something that's a management action. I'm not quite sure how to get there yet, but I think that people start to see that connection, see how powerful it is, should get people to realize why economists and social scientists are really important to the agency. But we're not there yet. But I was really stunned by how Markey, Blumenthal, Pingree, they all got the thing they want to focus on. And it affects your constituents.
I suspect we could keep talking forever, but in case some people have to head off, let's thank Richard one more time.